Thank you, Mary, for that really generous introduction. Thank you for being here. We saw a lot of very, very excited football fans on the train here, and it made me wonder if there was anyone left in Philly who wasn't sort of decked out in downtown. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you for the invitation. Thanks to Joseph also for inviting me out here. I'm really excited to present this material because it is very, very new. So I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and your feedback as I tiptoe into Irish and Irish American sort of comparative work. One of the hallmarks of the Celtic Tiger era was its invigorating sense of newness. From the moment of its official recognition in 1994, when the investment firm Morgan Stanley crowned Ireland's upswing the Celtic Tiger after the so-called Asian tiger economic miracles of the 60s. And until its collapse in 2008, the Irish boom was fueled by a deep sense of relief that the hardship of the past was firmly in the rear-view mirror. As the character in Declan Hughes' 2003 play Shiver explains, we put the old wounds behind us by dreaming hard of the future, by holding fast to now. The Celtic Tiger transformed both the shape and sensibility of Irish society, especially in the arrival of the new Irish, a term that marks both the group of immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers who arrived with the wave of prosperity, but that also articulates a new way of envisioning the nation's identity. And this series of stamps from the Irish Post issued in 2013 is one of many artifacts from that process of national renegotiation. Starting in 1996, the historically emigration-plagued Ireland, that's emigration with an E, witnessed a pattern of consistent inward migration that lasted until 2009. And I'll skip over the demographic details here, except simply to say that the early wave was led by Nigerian immigrants, and to a lesser degree, people from China and the Philippines. And then a second wave started in 2004, mainly comprised of Eastern European guest workers from the newly admitted EU member states. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when these newcomers began to be discussed in the aggregate as the new Irish, as an extension of the national body. But in the Sunday Independent's 2007 year-end review, Eamon Sweeney opens with the declaration, 2007 is the year when our national media decides to dub immigrant workers the new Irish. So how new were they? This afternoon, I want to take you on a literary, historical, etymological, and archival journey in order to begin answering that very question. We'll traverse from the mid-20th century to the 21st, from the Rust Belt of North America to the tower blocks of Northside Dublin. And along the way, we'll discover that the pairing of newness and Irishness is in fact a very old phenomenon. So historically speaking, the Celtic Tiger immigration was hardly new. Muslims, for example, had been living in Ireland since the late 18th century, with a permanent community forming after the Second World War. What did change in the 90s, though, were the volume of inward migration and the profiles, less affluent, less educated, of those who arrived. Similarly, asylum seekers had been trickling into Ireland since the post-war period, but the numbers soared during the Celtic Tiger years, going from 39 applications in 1992 to over 10,000 in 2001. Indeed, the sense that the floodgates had suddenly opened in Ireland during the early years of the upswing speaks less to the sheer volume of migration and more to Ireland's unusual delay in experiencing patterns of global resettlement that had long since transformed the society of many of its neighbors. In the literary record, the arrival and integration of the new Irish took some time to leave a substantial imprint, with a few notable exceptions. So, Donald Kelly's 1994 play Asylum, Asylum was one of the earliest works to consider the plight of Ireland's new migrants. Focused on a Ugandan man who arrives to the country without a visa, the play exposes both the dangers from which migrants often flee and the new state of legal limbo into which they enter. O'Kelly's allotment of subjectivity to a migrant character was rare at the time. More often, early Celtic Tiger writing presented the new Irish as a backdrop, charmingly colorful or faintly menacing, but usually subordinated to the narrative development of native Irish characters. That began to change in the new millennium. In 2000, Roddy Doyle started publishing serialized fiction in Metro Éireann, a multicultural newspaper founded that same year by Nigerian journalists Abel Ugba and Chinedu Onyejelam. Doyle's stories focused explicitly on the changing racial and ethnic makeup of Irish society, and on the mutual readjustments required of the native Irish and newcomers alike. The following year, Kavri Madhavan published her first novel, Paddy Indian, which follows a medical resident who relocates to Dublin and falls in love with an Irish woman. And although Madhavan had been living in Ireland since the late 1980s, the novel was celebrated as one of the first works written about the New Irish by the New Irish. More writing followed. From the German-Irish memoirs Hugo Hamilton, the Irish-Indian playwright Ursula Rani Sarmi, and the Nigerian playwright and director Biji Adigan, whose theater company Arambe Productions has produced both original work and African adaptations of well-known Irish and non-Irish plays. Perhaps the apotheosis of this first wave of New Irish writing was that the Abbey Theatre's commissioned centenary adaptation of J.M. Singh's 1907 play, The Playboy of the Western World, which was co-written by Doyle and Adigan and featured a Nigerian asylum seeker named Christopher Malomo in the role of the eponymous Playboy. So in order to understand the rapid movement of the New Irish, from the fringes of the literary scene to a position at center stage, let us consider two preliminary theses. So first, narratives about Ireland's new arrivals are always also narratives about the Irish themselves. This becomes apparent in a body of Celtic Tiger literary works that, like the 2007 Playboy, frame immigrants as the successors who are to inherit the homes, jobs, rituals, and even the literary roles formerly occupied by the New Irish. As we shall see, such celebrations of the new pluralist society also serve as occasions for performing the solidity, even the nonchalance, of prosperity. By bestowing upon their newcomers the opportunity to refashion themselves in the image of Hibernian success. And here's a still from the Playboy of the Western World, where I think we can see that sort of refashioning perfectly encapsulated. These works implicitly invite native citizens to reimagine themselves as having crossed the finish line of historical development. Second, the idea of the New Irish is not very new at all, nor is the terminology. In fact, the moniker had been invoked at least twice previously in Irish America, during the late 1940s and 50s, to describe the ethnic and racial diversity that was beginning to overtake formerly Irish neighborhoods in the upper Midwest. And again during the late 1980s, when the adjective new was used to distinguish the influx of educated, professional class Irish migrants to the Northeast Corridor from the poorer immigrants who had arrived one to several generations earlier. In these two historical moments, the term New Irish is used to mark a crucial turning point in the story of Irish assimilation and upward mobility in the United States. It articulates a willful belief in the linearity and finality of socioeconomic advancement. But the phrase also betrays, I'll show, a lingering suspicion that the history of emigration and immigration, far from unidirectional, may, in fact, repeat itself. It's instructive to return to these earlier moments so as to understand what is at stake in the exuberant cultural embrace of the New Irish during the Celtic Tiger years. And an embrace that, it's important to note, was not matched in other arenas of Irish public life. As Steve Garner and others have shown, racism was on the rise during the Celtic Tiger years, culminating in the 2004 referendum, which revoked automatic citizenship by birth in Ireland, and which was spurred in large part by anti-immigrant rhetoric about anchor babies and maternity tourism. In fact, the opening of the literary canon to new Irish writers, and the concomitant closing and contraction of political rights is no accident. These conflicting impulses present divergent solutions to a shared predicament: how to secure a state of predictable prosperity that you hope is permanent, but that you suspect to be entirely fleeting. So, our first stop is Detroit, 1949. In March of 1949, the Detroit Free Press published this article by staff writer William Pooler, titled "Magic in Corktown." This piece discusses the increasing racial and ethnic diversity of the predominantly Irish neighborhood on Detroit's west side, which was established by immigrants in the 1830s and 40s. Names have changed, the byline declares, but not the spirit. At the center of the spread appears a photo of 5 13-year-old school children standing around a statue of St. Patrick. This is a mid-century Benetton advertisement in the making. African American, Chinese, Maltese, Mexican, and Irish children bound together by their love of all things Irish, which the article goes on to detail. So I stumbled upon this gem late one night when I was pouring through Detroit's digitized city archives. And it caught my attention initially for very personal reasons. So my late mother was the daughter of Irish immigrants, and she grew up in Corktown during the 1940s and 50s. She would have been 7 at the time of the article's printing, so slightly younger than these school children. And her stories and photos, and her yearbook especially, really attest to the considerable diversity of the neighborhood at mid-century. Her best friend Rose came from a Maltese immigrant family. She married the son of Mexican immigrants who they went to school with. And by my mother's account, Corktown was a vibrant multi-ethnic enclave in the mid-century. Not without its racial tensions, but far more diverse and far more interwoven than the standard narrative of white flight typically allows. But the article also fascinated me because it bore such an uncanny resemblance to what I had been noticing for some time in the tone, tenor, and vocabulary of conversations about immigration in Ireland during the early 2000s. Take the terminology. This multiracial, multi-ethnic group of children photographed at center are dubbed the New Irish Kids of Corktown, or elsewhere, simply the New Corktowners. As in Celtic Tiger, Ireland, the word new is invoked to mark both continuity. The immigrants are imagined as successors to the Irish, and also racial and ethnic difference. This article also intersperses some, we'll say, quaint euphemisms very much of their day, the sunburned Irish and the dusky or dark-skinned Irish, phrases that are meant to distinguish the newcomers from the fairer complexioned residents who had populated Old Corktown. Similar too are the emphatic ways in which Irishness is ascribed to new immigrants and minorities in both historical moments. So here Pooler writes, "The Maltese brag that they are more Irish than the Mexicans, for they settled in Corktown first." And as he proceeds to detail the school children's multi-ethnic St. Patrick's Day pageant, glorious, he decrees, with more shamrocks on the cast than you'll find in all of County Mayo, Pooler muses that the children have found a oneness in all being Irish. Half a century later, Celtic Tiger Ireland would boast its own version of a hibernicized multi-ethnic plurality. And outlets like this 2004 St. Patrick's Day article in the Irish Independent, featuring 5 newly arrived immigrants who reflect upon their adopted country and what it means to be New Irish. Or the 2007 City Fusion pageant at Dublin St. Patrick's Day Parade, which celebrated Ireland's newfound diversity by showcasing an array of immigrant artists and community groups. Although the event had sought from the outset to be a collaborative and inclusive affair, the scholar Holly Maples is located within the production what she calls a performance of contradictions. one that stemmed from the tension between the organizers' representation of a unified yet distinctly Irish identity and the participants' own desire to highlight the distinctiveness of their own racial and ethnic heritages. Such tension, I want to suggest, is inevitable, insofar as it is etched into the very grammar of Irish multiculturalism. So the moniker New Irish presents a fundamental contradiction in terms, whether deployed in 1949 to describe the changing epidermal hue of US immigration, or in the 2000s to envision a globalized Irish society. On the one hand, it insists vociferously upon the Irishness of the newcomer, does so in fact to the exclusion of any other nationality by which the individual may identify. And some parties have criticized the term for exactly this reason, claiming that it deracinates the migrant while also establishing assimilation as a precondition for their continued welcome in Ireland. On the other hand, that Irishness is continually qualified by the word new and by the use of scare quotes, both of which imply a certain degree of inauthenticity. It is as though the migrant were a facsimile of Irishness, almost the same, to borrow Homi Bhabha's apt phrase, but not quite. Now, I'm less interested in the virtues or demerits of the term New Irish than in the larger narratives it serves, and nor am I interested, it should be clear, in declaring that anyone should or should not identify themselves as Irish. Rather, I want to ask what this fraught grammar and this grammar can teach us about the very idea of post-Irish immigration. The Detroit Free Press article invokes the new Irish immigrants pictured at center to tell a congratulatory story about the upward mobility and assimilation of Irish Americans at mid-century. And here's how the article concludes. The Irish have left behind in Corktown a strong tradition. They began moving on 50 years ago, becoming fine judges, merchants, builders. The new, darker Irish moved into their old homes, old church, old school seats. And there today, by some mystical alchemy, becoming Irish. The Mexicans, Maltese, Syrians, Negroes, and Filipinos all live in harmony. I have plenty to say about the end of this piece, about multi-ethnic harmony and the alchemy of becoming Irish, but that would risk sending me on a very, very long tangent. So instead, I'd like to focus our attention on Pooler's allusion here to three overlapping forms of mobility that Irish Americans had achieved over the course of the early 20th century. So one, economic. The Irish had become, in his words, fine judges, merchants, builders. That is, they advanced from the largely unskilled labor to the merchant and professional classes, and this is a pattern that historical research has corroborated. Two, geographic. As they move up socioeconomically, they also disperse into affluent areas of the city and increasingly, at the time of the publication of this article, into the suburbs. And this is a pattern that's replicated in my own family. My grandparents stayed in Corktown until very, very late in life when they just couldn't take care of themselves anymore. But their children dispersed all across the Metro Detroit area. And third, racial mobility. In his study, How the Irish Became White, the historian Joel Ignatieff has shown that although they were considered on par with African American and immigrant groups when they first arrived to the US, the Irish gradually propelled themselves into the very ranks of American whiteness itself. Magic in Corktown works hard to celebrate a pattern of Irish American mobility that it wants to believe is unidirectional. And yet it relies upon the new Irish to do so. In celebrating the arrival of darker immigrants and minorities to Corktown, the article attempts to will into being the permanence of the American dream and the security of Irish success. Indeed, the final line of the article reads, "The new Irish have sensed the essential story of American brotherhood, of opportunity for all, living as the new heirs of old Corktown." An intensely optimistic leave-taking, this conclusion also acts as a benediction. It bequeaths the neighborhood as a kind of legacy to be safeguarded by its new heirs. And yet, For all its celebration of what Corktown offered to Irish immigrants of my grandparents' generation and what it had achieved for them, the article is also tinged with a very real sense of loss. When Pooler laments the dearth of Irish students in a school where, quote, once the roll call sounded like a mustering of the Irish clans, I think he's doing more than simply mourning the bygone specificity of Corktown. He's also registering the unspoken knowledge that the neighborhood would change surely in the hands of its new arrivals. And it did. Far from becoming the Irish version 2.0, the new Corktowners left their own unique imprints upon the city of Detroit. Nor did they replicate their Irish forebears' particular path of socioeconomic advancement. But that's a point to which we will shortly return. In May 2000, Roddy Doyle published his first story for Metro Aaron, which bore a familiar title, Guess Who's Coming for the Dinner? A riff on the 1967 Stanley Kramer film starring Sidney Poitier, the action centers on the Dublin father, Larry Lennon, whose daughter Stephanie announced that she is bringing a Nigerian refugee named Ben home for dinner. Larry immediately assumes this means the two are dating. They're not. And his anxieties begin to mount. He spends the intervening days worrying about the prospect of having a black man at the table, or, he begins spinning, perhaps someday in his family. But he also worries about saying the wrong thing, or causing offense, or coming across as too racist. Ultimately, his concerns are for naught. Larry conquers his intolerance just in time to learn that the two are only friends. And the story ends as Ben directs him to an African store on Parnell Street where he might purchase a bottle of Towering Ebony cologne. And guess who's coming for the dinner? Doyle establishes a tone and narrative arc that many of his subsequent stories would follow. New and native Irish characters encounter one another. Foibles ensue, usually the stuff of comedy. And in those rare moments where racism does surface, either it's quickly vanquished or else relegated back into the backdrop. Doyle's Metro Aaron stories pulsate with a gentle lightheartedness as people in the new interracial Ireland learn to live with one another. This story also features what would become a recurring form in the author's work, and in Celtic Tiger writing more broadly: the multicultural sequel or adaptation. So in addition to the 2007 version of Playboy co-authored with Adigan, some notable examples include two other of Doyle's Metro Aaron stories, The Deportees, which is a sequel to his 1987 novel, The Commitments, and Home to Harlem, which is not so much an adaptation as a very loose reflection upon Claude McKay's 1927 novel of the same title. Adigan's play, The Paddies of Parnell Street, which is an adaptation of Jimmy Murphy's 2000 play, Kings of the High Kilburn Road, about Irish immigrants working in London, is also a good example. This pattern of returning to familiar territory, I argue, is more than a gimmick. Rather, the very act of adapting or sequelizing becomes fundamental to the ideological work of new Irish writing. The Deportees opens with a sobering revelation for anyone of the Commitments generation. Wunderkind Jimmy Rabbit, the visionary youth who created the North Dublin soul band in Doyle's first novel, is now middle-aged. Married with 3 kids and a 4th on his way, Jimmy decides to relive his glory days by forming a new band, but this time comprised solely of immigrants. White Irish, he jokes, need not apply. Though he does take a few white Irish in the end. As Jimmy assembles his group, 2 Africans, a Spaniard, a Russian, a Romanian father and son, a black American, 2 quirky white Irish, and an aging traveler, history appears to be repeating itself, this time with a colorful twist. The Deportees hinges on a form that I am calling the immigrant as sequel. And by that, I mean it's a form in Caroline Levine's capacious sense of the word, and here you'll notice Mary's influence on my thinking, something that is at once aesthetic and deeply embedded in social relations. and more importantly, something that travels between continents and historical periods, and even discursive registers. So aesthetically, The Immigrant as Sequel functions as a form of reassurance, peddling difference as a mere variation on the familiar. Both a strategic marketing ploy and an affective inoculation. It capitalizes on the comfort of the already proven. This is the case quite literally with the Playboy adaptation and the Deportees, which draw on two of the most globally successful Irish works to date. But the familiarity of the construct operates figuratively too, diffusing the perceived demographic and economic threat of immigration by aligning immigrants with those who came before. We can see this at work in the Magic in Corktown article, which invokes the successful assimilation of 19th and early 20th century Irish immigrants in order to assuage white residents' worries about the shifting racial and ethnic makeup of Detroit's neighborhood in the post-war period. In the 2007 Playboy adaptation and in the Deportees, The Immigrant as Sequel works a little bit differently, although the broad strokes are the same. Here, the new Irish take up not just the homes and neighborhoods, but the very literary roles, particularly those involving aspirational striving, formerly occupied by the peasant and working class white Irish. So both of these works center on the fantasy of unlikely musical success, the kind that brings not only personal satisfaction, but also begets social status. So Doyle and Adigan's asylum-seeking playboy Christopher aspires to become a global pop sensation along the lines of, and these are his examples, Akon or R. Kelly. Meanwhile, the Deportees just want to play under a roof rather than in the pouring rain. These two works encapsulate perfectly the signatures of The Immigrant as Sequel form. Tolerance is made safe, and the predictable repetition of late capitalist prosperity is enlivened by an amusing bit of variation. Even the divergences from the source texts err on the side of reassurance. In Doyle's world, the black man coming for dinner doesn't really want to marry your daughter. The murderous playboy turns out to have an MBA and a cushy job back home. And the Deportees' big break is a gig at the 21st birthday party for the daughter of the born-again owner of the local takeaway Celtic Tandoori. Doyle wants to be optimistic. The Deportees ends with Jimmy fantasizing about the group's prospective success, but the grammar remains tellingly future tense. They will tour Wales and Nigeria. They will cycle in and out of the country. They will gain legal status through marriage. They will not be deported. As Jimmy's fantasy goes into overdrive in the story's closing moments, the band in his imagination shares pizza and tea with the Wu-Tang Clan, Lauryn Hill, Bono, Eminem and his ma, and Yo-Yo Ma. We see just how hard Doyle's working to end on a hopeful note. Like Pooler's Free Press article, these Celtic Tiger works attempt to tell an optimistic story about upward mobility and multicultural generosity of the native Irish, who, having reached the telos of prosperity, benevolently cede to the new immigrants the opportunity to work themselves up the socioeconomic ladder. And like Magic in Corktown, these literary texts also pulsate with a sense of loss. Especially for aging Jimmy Rabbit, the new Irish immigrants stir in him a youthful, working-class ambitiousness that he can now only seem to access by proxy. It is as if the native Irish are no longer fitting subjects for stories of upward mobility, and thus The Immigrant as Sequel must step forward to stand as surrogate for a bygone, reckless kind of Irish longing. Joe Cleary has identified an end-of-history structure of feeling that he claims weighs upon Celtic Tiger literary production. And I think Cleary's right in gesturing to Francis Fukuyama's 1989 pronouncement that the end of history had arrived. And by that, he meant the end of viable alternatives to capitalism. Events may continue, he says, but the time for vast, epochal change has come to pass. I would add that in Celtic Tiger literature, it's not only history, but development itself, the development of the native Irish body, and the youthful pursuit of bildung that has come to arrest. This is why the attention must shift in these works to the still developing corporate body of the New Irish. Celtic Tiger sequels register serious doubts about the finality of prosperity. The Deportees ends in a tellingly speculative fashion, and 6 years later, Doyle would write another sequel called The Guts that returns to an all-white cast of characters. So we see Jimmy Rabbit again, and there's no mention of the Deportees, which I think is really interesting. In recessionary literature, the New Irish are simply written out. Meanwhile, the 2007 Playboy adaptation, It Could Be Said, doth protest too much. Christopher Malomo's considerable privilege, which is far more than Christy Mann ever had, is not just reassuring, it actually threatens to invalidate that role altogether. This is a necessary trade-off, perhaps, for the real immigrant sequel to Playboy, a story about a poor, uneducated Nigerian father killer who almost scams his way into an Irish family and inheritance, is one that cannot be told as entertainment. Our next stop will be brief. During the latter 1980s, the term New Irish reappeared in the lexicon of northeastern US. Coined by New York's Irish Immigration Reform Movement, or IIRM, the moniker served to distinguish late 20th century Irish arrivals from the poorer immigrants who had preceded them. An August 1987 article in the Irish Press about the group's Boston branch declares, "New Irish make a big impact." But the term was not limited to the United States. It circulated far and wide, accompanying the well-educated professional class immigrants who left Ireland during the recession of the late 80s. So in Australia, and in Britain, and elsewhere, the phrase was used to classify a new breed of immigrants who were attractive and articulate, ambitious in a way their predecessors were not. The poet Eamon Wall, who identifies as New Irish or commuter rather than exile, has reflected upon what distinguishes his generation of immigrants from their forebears. He notes, "It is rare to hear the New Irish declare how grateful they are for the opportunity to work in the United States. They know they have earned the right to play a part in the international economy." And yet these immigrants also harken back to those who came before them. So Wall continues, "They may be better educated, may use more sophisticated forms and language than their predecessors, who created melodies and lyrics. But they frequently share common sentiments and a sense of loss." This latter comment is important insofar as it acknowledges a continuity with the past that is conspicuously absent in Doyle's fiction or in media portrayals of the Irish emigration. The earlier article about Corktown was laced with a faint premonition that the course of Irish American development may not be unidirectional, that the revolving series of eager and deserving replacement immigrants, like the never-ending supply of late capitalist prosperity itself, may eventually run dry. Wall's essay makes this point plain and clear. History does repeat itself. The telos of modernity, in fact, serves more often as a temporary resting point than a permanent destination. At one point in his essay, Wall recounts the heartbreaking moment when his father realized that his son would never move back home. And this is what the father tells Wall. "This wasn't supposed to happen. We worked hard, and we believed that emigration was over. But here it is starting all over again. What went wrong?" And finally, Ballymun. Our story this afternoon comes to its own resting point, not a conclusion. In Ballymun, the North Dublin suburb that was the site of an ultimately failed public housing experiment during the 1960s. Spurred by the promise of similar projects in Europe and the catastrophic collapse of an old tenement building in city center, the Dublin City Council decided to erect a group of tower blocks in what had been the rural outskirts of the city, including 7 15-story towers that were unveiled in 1966 during the 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising, named after the 7 signatories of the proclamation. The Ballymun Flats bore the utopian dreams of post-De Valera Ireland. When Sean Lemass became Taoiseach in 1959 and began a program of economic development, he led those of Eamon Wall's father's generation to believe that Ireland had finally become a modern nation that could support their children and their children's children. In fact, so much of the rhetoric suffusing the Celtic Tiger can actually be traced back to this earlier wave of economic upswing. The Ballymun Flats quickly turned out to be a disaster, as the second image reveals. Elevators broke, the shops and transportation promised to new tenants never arrived, and those who could afford to leave did so. And these phenomena will be deeply familiar to any of you who saw or read about the ghost estates that appeared and studied the Irish landscape once the property bubble had ended, right? These abandoned housing projects. Ballymun soon became riddled with the problems that tend to afflict neglected populations, like unemployment, drug addiction, gang violence, and the like. By 1997, the flats were slated to be destroyed and the area rebuilt. And during the period of demolition, so the first towers were demolished in 2004 and the last ones were demolished in late 2015. The playwright Dermot Bolger was commissioned to write a trilogy of plays dedicated to Ballymun, which would be staged at the Axis Ballymun Arts Center. This is a mixed-use performance and community space built as part of this regeneration project, and it houses a lot of services organizations that really cater to Ballymun's population. It's with the second of these 3 plays, The Townlands of Brazil, produced in 2006, that I wish to dwell a few moments in order to consider what an alternative to the Immigrant as sequel might look like and what it might accomplish. So I've already addressed the aesthetic dimensions of this construct, which I argue are aimed at repetition and familiarity. But there are also socio-political implications as well. The Immigrant as sequel tends to be a conservative form that quells the disaffection of the underclass by peddling a fantasy of upward mobility, all the while separating individuals from one another. It announces to temporary victors, like the Irish-American Corktowners at mid-century, or Native Irish residents during the 1990s and early aughts, you have made it. And those who follow you will make it too. The newcomers will not be used as cheap labor sources. They will not take your jobs, nor will they consume the already insufficient supply of social welfare. They are starting at the bottom like you. And if they rise, or rather when they rise, it will be because of your example. Bolger is doing something very different in his Ballymun trilogy. He leans into, rather than skirts, the cyclicality of migration and the ephemerality of economic boom and bust. He does so through a series of theatrical devices wherein the past overlaps with and blends with the present. So in The Townlands of Brazil, the story of a pregnant young emigrant's exile to London in the 1960s is overlaid with a nearly identical story about a Polish woman, Monica, who arrives to the Celtic Tiger Island in search of work and opportunity. And what's more interesting, the same actors play Native Irish characters in the first act and new immigrants in the second act. It's this narrative and bodily mirroring where I think Bolger offers an important corrective to the Immigrant as sequel, channeling it into a mode of critique rather than a mechanism for reinforcing consensus. Early in the play, Monica, that is the new Polish arrival, delivers a monologue. The that voices powerfully the shared and often painful histories of migration that connect Native Irish residents with their newly arrived immigrant counterparts. This is what she says. Looking from this rented bedroom window, I just see a building site. But one day the new Ballymun will be finished. The last crane driver and plasterer will pack his tools for another construction site in Europe. People like us who follow the work. Irish, Poles, Latvians. Landscapes change, our faces and nationalities change, our clothes, even our jobs. But nothing else changes. We leave home to seek work or sanctuary, and the farther we go, the more home becomes frozen in our minds. And finally, a postscript. So amidst that late night archival hunt in Detroit's archives, I mean, I was up at like 4 in the morning. I had things to do the next day, but I was riveted. I found this stunning photo that suggests at least one brief moment when Irish Americans and minority residents in Corktown banded together in the late 70s to protest the incursion of business interests in the neighborhood. So this image. It's of a 1978 protest on the porch of a house purchased 5 years earlier by Cunningham drugstores, then a local chain. The company had refused to repair or rent the house, and shortly before this photo was taken, announced that it would demolish the home in order to make space for a parking lot. The community waged a campaign and a legal action against the company, which ultimately proved unsuccessful. But it illustrates a very different sequence of events and a different sensibility than the one that Pooler had imagined in 1949. The signs displayed by the residents draw explicitly the link between Irish and other immigrants' shared experiences of dispossession, which Magic and Corktown had worked hard to disavow. They read Corktown, the home of the immigrants. Corktown, the home of the homeless. Corktown, the home of the needy and the forgotten. This photo speaks so elegantly to patterns of abandonment, urban resettlement, racial ghettoization, and predatory lending practices in Detroit that I'm only beginning to learn about. These are patterns that loop across the Atlantic and back, reminding us that the global histories of Irish migration are still unfolding. I didn't have time to work into the talk, but let me show you this image. This is a contemporary activist group called the Tricycle Collective in Detroit. And they offer loans to individuals whose houses have been repossessed so that they can repurchase their home. And this is a really beautiful mural they did, but there are lots of photos of houses that have just these tiny little signs that say, "This is a home, do not bid." Which I just find so beautiful and so resonant to what I study in Irish literature.